Section 1. The architecture of intimidation. The courtyard is vast, and the air is heavy with the scent of spiced wine and blooming gardens. Why does the text pause to count the silver rings and measure the marble pillars? The problem is not that the opening verses are overly descriptive. Pain, death, mourning, and poverty had to be strictly quarantined outside the walls. The empire demanded a permanent facade of total control. This makes Mordecai's action incredibly dangerous. He is bringing the scheduled genocide of his people right up to the very edge of the king's artificial paradise. The king's gate becomes a physical collision point. On one side of the stone archway, spiced wine, golden vessels, and the illusion of immortality. On the other side, coarse sackcloth, ash, and the devastating reality of human suffering. Mordecai presses his agony against the polished stone of Susa, but the law prevents him from taking one step further. The empire will not allow his pain to interrupt its banquet. Mordecai is weeping at the gate. The loud, bitter wail of a Jewish exile echoes against the heavily fortified walls, but as we move past him, deeper into the citadel, the sound is completely swallowed by the heavy curtains and marble pillars. Inside the royal halls, where the actual decisions are made, something far more unsettling is happening. In the middle of this crisis, the most shocking detail of the story emerges, not through what is spoken, but through a terrifying silence. Section 5. The silence in the citadel. The heavy stone walls of Susa do more than block the sound of Mordecai's wailing. They seem to block the very presence of heaven. When you step past the king's gate and enter the inner courts of the citadel, the problem is that we fail to recognize what the description is doing. We look at the gold and see merely interior design. The most terrifying element of the story is not the lethal power of King Ahasuerus. It is the absolute, deafening absence of the God of Israel. Every reader of the Bible eventually confronts the famous anomaly of the book of Esther. God is never mentioned. Not once. Not Yahweh. Not Elohim. There is no temple. No priest. No prophet. No burning bush. And no voice speaking from the heavens. In a book entirely about the miraculous survival of God's chosen people, the divine name has been completely erased from the parchment. For centuries, scholars and readers have asked why a biblical author would omit God from a book of the Bible, but the silence is not a theological accident. It is a brilliant literary mirror. The author is deliberately forcing the reader to experience exactly what it felt like to live in Susa. In this pagan fortress, the empire is overwhelmingly loud. The king's decrees are absolute. The wealth is visible. The danger is imminent. And in the face of a legally binding, state-sponsored genocide, heaven feels completely silent. It is the theological crisis of the exile, the terrifying, creeping suspicion that God has abandoned his people to the machinery of Persia. In Hebrew, the text actually plays on this theme of concealment. The Persian name Esther sounds remarkably like the Hebrew word Hester, meaning hidden. But in the ancient world, this was not decoration. It was dominion. Susa is not a passive setting. It is an active, overwhelming force. Centuries earlier, in Deuteronomy 31-18, God warned a rebellious Israel of the ultimate consequence of their exile. I will surely hide my face from them in that day. The book of Esther is the narrative reality of that hiddenness. God has veiled himself behind the marble pillars of a foreign court. But the biblical writer is playing a profound game with the reader. The author removes the name of God to force us to look for the hand of God. This is the literary and theological midpoint of the story. Up to this point, the question has been historical and administrative. Now, we are asked to recognize a pattern, step back, and look at the architecture of the plot. Esther just happens to be chosen as queen. Mordecai just happens to overhear an assassination plot. The king just happens to suffer from insomnia on the exact night before Haman plans to execute Mordecai. A servant just happens to open the royal chronicles to the exact page recording Mordecai's forgotten loyalty. None of this is a miracle of fire and thunder. There is no parted sea. Instead, the unseen God hijacks the very bureaucracy of the empire. He weaponizes the insomnia of a pagan king. He orchestrates the rustling of a page in an administrative ledger. It is an architectural and bureaucratic machine designed to do one specific thing, to make the individual feel entirely powerless. The silence of Susa is an illusion. The central thesis of the book is that God's providence is most active exactly where the secular world seems most in control. If this is how Susa operates as a massive, intimidating stage for God's hidden providence, what happens when another biblical hero is stationed in this exact same palace decades later? Because the story of this citadel does not end with Ahasuerus. Esther was not the only Jewish exile navigating the hidden dangers of this fortress. Section 6. The cupbearer in the fortress. The golden cup is heavy. Before it reaches the lips of the king, the wine must be tasted for poison. The man holding the cup stands in the exact same palace, walking across the exact same mosaic pavement of porphyry and marble. It is several decades later. King Ahasuerus is dead. His successor, Artaxerxes, now sits on the golden throne. But the fortress of Susa has not changed. It is still the winter capital. It is still the administrative heart of the world. And it is still a machine designed to erase the identity of its captives. The opening verse of a later biblical book drops us immediately back into this familiar, terrifying architecture. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, and to make the God of Israel appear completely irrelevant. Look closer at the sensory weight of the scene. The guests are not just being fed. The man speaking is Nehemiah. He holds the office of cupbearer to the king. Modern readers often assume a cupbearer was merely a servant or a glorified butler. In the Persian court, the cupbearer was an elite official of immense political influence. He controlled access to the king. He was trusted with the king's very life. Nehemiah has achieved the highest level of assimilation and success a Jewish exile could possibly imagine. By all metrics, he has survived Susa. The empire has given him total security. Then, the message reaches him from Judah. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down. Its gates are burned with fire. Notice the architectural pattern repeating. Just as Mordecai wailed in sackcloth at the edge of the city, Nehemiah sits down and weeps inside it. Both men are surrounded by the empire's absolute peak of wealth. Both are offered every reason to forget their defeated homeland. Yet both of their hearts remain violently anchored to the rubble of Jerusalem. But Nehemiah faces a danger that Mordecai did not. Mordecai was legally stopped at the king's gate because no one was allowed to enter clothed in mourning. Nehemiah's job requires him to stand directly in the center of the throne room. He has to carry his grief into the very presence of the king. Remember the Persian theology of royal perfection. To show sadness before the king was to suggest that his empire was flawed, or that he was incapable of providing perfect joy. They are being conditioned. Every gleaming golden cup, every massive marble pillar, every cold, perfectly cut stone beneath their sandals is a weapon of statecraft. It was a direct insult to the crown, and it was a capital offense. For months, Nehemiah masks his mourning, but eventually, the crushing weight of Jerusalem's ruin bleeds through his expression. Nehemiah chapter 2 records the terrifying collision. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad? Seeing you are not sick, this is nothing but sadness of the heart." Nehemiah's next words reveal the true stakes of the moment. Then I was very much afraid. This is not stage fright. This is a man staring down the absolute, unbending law of the Medes and Persians. If the king's anger is provoked, Nehemiah will be executed, and no legal mechanism can save him. He is a captive standing at the epicenter of global power, entirely at the mercy of a sovereign who views human sorrow as treason. Susa seems invincible. It has the walls, the wealth, the armies, and the law. How does God break the absolute power of this city without sending a single army against it? The breakthrough comes not from the outside, but through a brilliant subversion on the inside. God does not shatter the walls of Susa with an earthquake. He does not send down fire from heaven to burn the citadel to the ground. Instead, the unseen God orchestrates the most brilliant, humiliating reversal in biblical history by using the empire's own weapons against it. The luxury is a carefully calculated mechanism meant to shrink the human spirit. When you sit on a couch of solid gold inside a fortress, in both the story of Nehemiah and the story of Esther, the terrifying power of the Persian court is neutralized in a matter of seconds. For Nehemiah, a silent prayer turns the wrath of the king into a sudden offer of timber and armed escorts. But it is in the book of Esther that the bureaucratic machine of Susa is completely hijacked. Look at how the tables are carefully, methodically turned. Haman, obsessed with his own status, builds a wooden gallows 50 cubits high, about 75 feet. It is an architectural monument to his own pride, designed to display Mordecai's corpse to the entire city. But through a perfectly timed sequence of divine coincidences, a sleepless king, a suddenly opened book of historical records, and a second royal banquet, the monument to Haman's pride, becomes the instrument of his own execution. The king orders Haman to be hanged on the very wood he erected. But Haman's death does not solve the administrative crisis. The first edict, the law ordering the genocide of the Jews, has already been sealed with the king's signet ring. And as we know, the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked, not even by the king himself. So, God does not revoke it. He overwhelms it. In Esther, chapter 8, King Ahasuerus takes off his signet ring, the exact same heavy gold ring he had previously handed to Haman, that controls the known world. The message is unspoken but absolute. The empire provides everything. The empire controls everything. The empire is God, and he gives it to Mordecai. Mordecai immediately summons the exact same royal scribes. They sit in the same administrative offices. They press their styluses into clay and parchment, translating a new law into the exact same languages of the 127 provinces. This second edict legally authorizes the Jewish people to assemble and defend themselves against any armed force that attacks them. The first law is overridden not by cancellation, but by a superior legal authorization. Then, the biblical text repeats the chilling imagery from chapter 3, but this time, it is a mechanism of salvation. The scroll is sealed. The couriers mount the royal relay horses, the fast steeds bred from the king's own stud, and they thunder out of the citadel courtyard. Driven by the king's command, the empire's own postal system is used to outrun its own death warrant. Susa thought it was the sovereign author of history. It turns out, the Persian Empire, with all its marble pillars, its legal rigidity, its fast horses, and its gold was merely a stage. God casually borrowed the empire's own paperwork to protect his chosen people. This is the great reversal. The physical architecture of Susa remains intact, but its psychological and spiritual power has been entirely broken from the inside. This is not ultimately a story about the luxury of a Persian fortress. It is a story about where God is found when the empire feels too big. The history is resolved. The Jewish people survive, and the Persian Empire eventually crumbles into the dust of antiquity. But the question remains, what does the citadel of Susa actually mean for us? We no longer live under the rule of Persian kings, and we do not negotiate for our lives on mosaic pavements of porphyry. But the spirit of Susa has never truly disappeared. The physical city of Susa is gone. The massive stone walls have collapsed, and the mosaic pavements of porphyry and marble lie buried beneath the dust of modern-day Iran. But the psychological reality of Susa, the massive, indifferent machine that demands total assimilation, is still very much alive. What is the Susa in your life? It may not be a fortress of literal stone and gold. It might be a corporate environment that demands your total, uncritical loyalty. It could be an academic system that views your faith as a naive liability. It might be a political culture built on absolute compliance, or an economic system that reduces your human worth entirely to your productivity. Susa is any space where secular power feels overwhelming, where the rules seem rigged against your convictions, and where God feels terrifyingly silent. When you are surrounded by an empire that controls the wealth, the laws, And the narrative. The temptation is always the same: assimilate, and his people feel too small. For the Jewish exiles living in the shadow of this citadel, Susa was a daily reminder of their permanent displacement. Blend in. Stop weeping over the ruins of Jerusalem. Accept the Persian name, and quietly take your place at the banquet. But the historical records of Esther, Mordecai, and Nehemiah provide a concrete blueprint for living faithfully inside the machine. First, they practiced strategic obedience. They did not try to burn the palace down. They learned the language. They navigated the bureaucracy. They stood respectfully in the king's presence and did their jobs with excellence. But they never gave the empire their souls. They lived and worked inside the citadel without ever belonging to it. Second, they maintained a holy grief. Susa demanded a permanent facade of control and manufactured happiness. But both Mordecai and Nehemiah allowed their hearts to break publicly for the things that mattered to God. In a modern culture that insists on numbing every pain with endless distraction and luxury, what are you willing to grieve? What is the pressure of your environment revealing about where your true loyalties lie? Finally, they trusted the unseen providence of God. You may be sitting in an office, a classroom, or a hospital waiting room right now, asking why heaven refuses to speak. You may be facing a legal, medical, or financial machine that feels as unbending as the law of the Medes and Persians. White and violet linen hangings are fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings. The pillars are pure marble. Jerusalem was in ruins. The temple of Yahweh had been reduced to ash. And here, standing in defiant contrast, was the impregnable fortress of Susa. The Book of Esther was written specifically for that feeling. It proves that divine silence is not divine absence. You do not need a parted sea or a voice from the clouds to know that God is active. He is currently orchestrating the page turns, the restless nights, the delayed conversations, and the seemingly random coincidences of your life. He specializes in taking the very mechanisms that threaten you and hijacking them for your deliverance. It is incredibly easy to feel small when the secular world is loud. It is tempting to believe that your quiet integrity in an ordinary week accomplishes nothing against massive cultural forces. But your responsibility is not to overthrow the empire. Your responsibility is to remain faithful at whatever post you have been assigned, trusting the God who directs the machinery of the world from behind the curtain. Yet, to fully grasp what that quiet faithfulness ultimately achieves, there is only one place left to look, to understand the final victory. It requires returning to the threshold where the weeping first began. We began at a banquet. The heavy scent of spiced wine, the massive marble pillars, the cold, meticulously arranged mosaic pavement, bursting with limitless resources, protected by an absolute legal system, and guarded by a massive threshold known as the King's Gate, of porphyry and mother of pearl beneath the sandals of the exiles. And just outside, we saw the King's Gate, heavily guarded, where a man covered in ash and sackcloth was legally barred from taking another step forward. For the captive, Susa was designed to be the end of the story. It was the architectural proof that the empire was sovereign, that the bureaucratic laws of men were irreversible, and that the God of Israel had vanished into absolute silence. But step back and look at the complete historical pattern of what actually happened inside this pagan fortress. First, the text proves that human power, no matter how intimidating or absolute, is incredibly fragile. The empire that could schedule a genocide across 3 continents could not control the king's sleep. It could not predict the calculated courage of a Jewish queen. It could not stop the unseen hand of God, moving quietly in the shadows of its own palace. Second, we discover that divine silence is not divine absence. God did not need to shout from the heavens to prove he was in control. He did not send a plague or part a river. This gate was the dividing line between the favored inside and the vulnerable outside. To enter, the presence of the king was life. He quietly authored the greatest reversal in biblical history, using the enemy's own signet rings. Postal system. and administrative paperwork. Third, we learn that true faithfulness does not always mean escaping the empire. Sometimes, God calls his people to stand right in the middle of the marble pillars, serving the city with excellence while refusing to surrender to its gods. And because of that, hidden, steady faithfulness. The central image of Susa is entirely transformed. Look at the King's Gate one final time. It is the exact same stone threshold. The same elite guards stand watch. The same shadow falls across the courtyard. But the man walking through the archway has changed. Esther 8:15 records the breathtaking, full-circle reversal. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The coarse sackcloth is gone. The bitter weeping has stopped. The massive gate that once stood as an impenetrable barrier of exclusion, danger, and terror has become the very place where God's people stand in influence. The golden couches and the silver rings remain in the banquet hall, but they have been completely stripped of their psychological power. To be cast out was death. Susa was not just a city, it was psychological warfare built of stone and gold. The empire tried to consume the exiles, but it ultimately funded their deliverance. Susa was nothing more than a temporary stage built for the enduring faithfulness of God. When you walk into your own modern fortress tomorrow, whether it is an intimidating corporate culture, a hostile secular environment, or a season of crushing personal delay, you do not need to be afraid of the gold and the marble. You do not need to fear the rigid laws of the system. This is not ultimately a story about the terrifying strength of a Persian capital. It is a story about the quiet, unstoppable sovereignty of the God who rules the empires of the earth without ever breaking his silence. The walls of Susa are loud, but they are temporary. The hidden providence of God is forever. The biblical writer wants the reader to feel the crushing, undeniable weight of this environment before the story even begins. You are meant to feel the impossibility of surviving in a place like this without being entirely swallowed by it. Why does the text demand that we understand the precise architecture of this pagan city to understand the danger of Susa? We have to look at what this fortress actually represented in the ancient world. Step back from the mosaic pavement of the banquet hall and look at the map of the ancient world. The Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus was not merely a large kingdom, it was a staggering, borderless reality. The biblical text explicitly states that this empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing 127 provinces, beneath the feet of the guests. The ground is a meticulously arranged mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious colored stones. For the people living within its borders, Persia did not feel like a nation. It felt like the entire world. At the administrative heart of this global superpower was Susa, or Shushan, the fortress. Persian kings maintained multiple capitals, migrating with the seasons to avoid extreme weather. Susa served as the primary winter residence. Located at the foot of the Zagros Mountains in what is now southwestern Iran, it was an ancient city that Darius the Great had aggressively rebuilt into a monument of imperial dominance. The biblical text repeatedly uses a specific word to describe it, bira, a Hebrew loanword from Akkadian, meaning a citadel, a fortress, or a heavily fortified acropolis. Susa was not a civilian resort. It was an impregnable military and administrative command center, surrounded by massive fortifications. The citadel sat elevated above the surrounding plains, physically looking down on the lower city. Inside these secure walls, scribes meticulously recorded taxes from across the known world. Treasuries held the looted wealth of conquered nations. Imperial couriers mounted on fast horses waited at the gates, ready to carry royal decrees across a vast network of paved roads. The decisions made on this fortified hill. Men recline on couches made entirely of gold and silver. They are drinking royal wine from golden vessels. And no two vessels are exactly alike, rippled out to affect millions of human lives across 3 continents. Now, place a Jewish exile into this landscape. To be an Israelite living in the shadow of the Susa citadel was to be confronted daily with a profound theological crisis. Susa was everything Jerusalem was not. Jerusalem's walls were broken down, its temple destroyed, its royal line humiliated, and its people scattered. But Susa was thriving. Susa was permanent. The massive stone walls of the Persian citadel seemed to actively mock the burnt rubble of Zion. For the exiles, the immediate danger of Susa was not physical execution. The far greater threat was assimilation. When a person is surrounded by an empire that is endlessly prosperous, culturally dominant, and militarily invincible, the temptation to let go of a defeated identity becomes overwhelming. Why hold on to the strict customs of a ruined city when the winter capital of the world is offering a place in its courts? The empire wants to absorb the exile. It wants to give the captive a Persian name, teach them the Persian language, and integrate them into its machinery until the memory of Jerusalem completely fades. This is the citadel of Susa. It is the winter capital of the Persian Empire. And King Ahasuerus, known to history as Xerxes, is hosting a feast. The architecture of Susa was designed to make the God of Abraham seem small, distant, and historically irrelevant. But the true strength of this capital was not actually in its marble pillars or its elevated stone walls. An empire of this magnitude could not be held together by architecture alone. It required something far more rigid. Susa was governed by an invisible infrastructure that controlled the lives of everyone inside and outside the gate. It relied on a mechanism of statecraft so absolute that it terrified even the men who created it. The physical fortress was formidable. But the true power of Susa rested in a legal system that even the king himself could not stop. That system brings us to the most dangerous mechanism inside the city, a piece of soft clay. The heavy, deliberate press of a gold ring. The sudden, irreversible finality of a royal seal. A scribe rolls the parchment, bends it, and hands it to a waiting courier. The rider mounts a royal horse bred specifically for speed, turning sharply out of the citadel courtyard and thundering down the paved road. With that single, quiet administrative action in a closed room. For 180 days, he has displayed the staggering wealth of his kingdom, culminating in a 7-day banquet for all the people present in the fortress. An entire population is condemned to die. The Persian Empire did not hold the ancient world together by military brute force alone. It maintained its grip through a massive, unrelenting obsession with administration. Susa was a fortress of paperwork. Inside its walls, armies of scribes meticulously documented taxes, treaties, and royal edicts. Everything was categorized. Everything was legislated. And governing all of this was a terrifying legal principle. The law of the Medes and Persians could never be revoked. The Persian legal system demanded the illusion of royal infallibility. Once an edict was sealed with the king's signet ring, it became an unchangeable law of the universe. To revoke a law would be to admit that the king had made an error, which the empire could not allow. Therefore, a sealed decree was theoretically impossible to repeal, even if the king later regretted it. The biblical text emphasizes this mechanical, unbending rigidity. When Haman, the king's highest official, plots to annihilate the Jewish people, he does not rally a chaotic mob. He requests a legal decree. King Ahasuerus casually removes his signet ring and hands it to his advisor. That ring holds the concentrated, absolute power of the empire. With it, Haman summons the royal secretaries. Esther chapter 3 details the chilling efficiency of the process. The death warrant is drafted, translated into the precise script of every province. When most readers open the Book of Esther, they treat this opening scene as nothing more than a lavish establishing shot. It is a wealthy party, perfectly stamped, and handed to the imperial postal system. This postal network was the envy of the ancient world. Relays of men and horses were stationed a day's journey apart, ready to carry the king's will across mountains and deserts at unprecedented speed. When a law left Susa, it was inescapable. The crisis in this story is deeply, profoundly administrative. The genocide of the Jews is not an act of sudden passion. It is a cold, state-sponsored, perfectly legal bureaucracy. Imagine the psychological terror for the Jewish exiles. Your destruction has been scheduled on a calendar. The decree is posted in your province, stamped with the unquestionable seal of Susa. There is no appeal. There is no higher court. The imperial machine has simply processed your death. The biblical author captures the grotesque detachment of this power in one devastating sentence. After the fast horses, race out with the execution orders. Esther 3:15 records, the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. The casual clinking of golden cups over a signed death warrant. That is the true horror of Susa. The empire does not even lose sleep over the lives it legally erases. But how do you fight a legal system that is designed to be impossible to change? How do you survive a city where the law of death is mathematically and legally irreversible? A generic ancient palace. Convenient. Shimmering backdrop where the real human drama of queens and courtiers will eventually unfold. The answer is not found in an armed rebellion. It is found at the very edge of the palace. To understand how this unstoppable bureaucratic machine will eventually be broken, we have to look at a specific architectural boundary. The shadow of the massive stone archway provides little relief from the tension. Elite guards stand watch with heavy spears. Scribes hurry past carrying clay tablets and rolled parchment. Foreign diplomats negotiate for favor. And spies trade whispered intelligence. And sitting directly in the center of this imperial traffic is a man covered in coarse, dark goat hair and pale ash, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. This is the King's Gate. In Hebrew, Sha'ar HaMelech. Modern readers often picture Mordecai as a beggar or a loiterer sitting on the street outside the palace doors. But in the ancient Near East, the gate of a city was not merely a physical entrance. It was the nerve center of society. The gate functioned as the local courthouse, the city council, the stock market, and the intelligence hub combined. To sit in the King's Gate was a formal administrative idiom. It meant Mordecai was an appointed official, a magistrate, but the biblical author spends an unusual amount of time describing the floor. Why do we need to know the exact stones in the mosaic pavement, or a trusted asset in the Persian bureaucratic machine? The gate was a place of extreme paranoia and surveillance. Earlier in the book, it is exactly at this threshold that Mordecai overhears two royal guards plotting to assassinate the king. It is a place where a single whispered secret can alter the course of an empire. But on the day the death edict is published, Mordecai does not whisper. He strips off his official garments, puts on sackcloth, and takes the private terror of the Jewish people and makes it aggressively public. Yet, as he approaches the palace, he hits a sudden, invisible wall. Esther 4:2 notes a chilling architectural and legal boundary. He went as far as the King's Gate. For no one might enter the King's Gate clothed with sackcloth. Why was this boundary so absolute? Because the Persian court was built on the theology of royal perfection. The king was officially presented as the source of all prosperity, light, and joy. Therefore, human suffering was deeply offensive to the crown. To bring grief into the king's presence was to suggest that his empire was flawed, or worse, that the king was incapable of providing perfect happiness. To weep inside the citadel was a crime against the state.